sweet.
With
Session is being filmed today by Carl King with Curry Voices. And primarily I'm assuming this is going to be focused on my presentation, but if there's anyone uncomfortable having their image on video, I guess either A, don't step in front of the camera, or B, let Carl know.
The video will be shown on channel 182 in Central County. That's on the Commissioner's Charter channel. It will also be on a website, currycountyvoices.com.
Oh boy.
In a week or two. Once it's on the website, it is on YouTube.
Oh my.
Available forever
yes to?
worldwide. So
super, I can send it home to family.
you can. And we are recording.
Oh, even better. You'll have to edit that part out. Well, we might as well get going. Hope you all enjoyed your tasting samples. It sounds like some of you weren't aware that that was a thing, so yay, food. I'll do a brief introduction and then we'll roll into our presentation today about freezing foods. There will be an in-depth portion about freezing convenience foods because as you saw when you decided to show up today that it was about freezer meals. But there are some components to utilizing your freezer as a form of food preservation that I want to go over first so that you know how to have the best quality product coming out of your freezers. So my name is Margie House. I am a coordinator with OSU Extension Service. I serve both the 4-H program as well as Family Community Health, providing community education on food preservation and food safety, which is where our focus is today. We bring research-based material from the university out to the counties, and so that's what the OSU Extension Office really provides you all, among various other things that is a whole other presentation topic. So we'll just focus on what we're here for today, which is learning how to freeze foods for the best quality product. And what I'm hoping you walk away with today is some information that will help you to be pulling out high quality products for your family, utilizing one of the easiest forms of food preservation out there because the majority of us, show of hands, who has a freezer at home?
Three.
There you go. So we'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages of this method of food preservation. We'll talk about different pre-treating methods for both fruits and vegetables, review some packaging options and how to best store things like meat and seafood. Like I said, we'll go in depth to the topic of freezing convenience meals. A lot of things that you'll see out there lately on Pinterest. There are some food safety aspects that make some of the recipes that are out there not necessarily kosher, and so we'll review some of those tips and then talk about how to notice signs of spoilage, if something's coming out looking kind of funky, whether or not you should eat it. And we'll talk about what to do if your freezer fails, because that is one of the biggest drawbacks of freezing things, is that you've now got this stockpile that's contingent upon your electricity source never failing. And we all know that especially certain times of year, we are subject to electricity failure. So there is a whole handout that you have in your packet, and we'll review some of the highlights from that packet to talk about what to do and how to prepare for that situation. So the advantages of freezing, like I said, it's super easy. We all typically now have a freezer at home. It's one of the first forms of food preservation that there really was, but it was place-based. So you had to be in a place that snowed and had ice if you wanted to store food this way, and then come along to like the 1900s and the advent of cold food storage comes along, and now we're able to safely store things for longer periods of time. It's simple, it's the least time consuming, so if anyone has ever pressure canned tuna, you know you've got to start that process, you know, at 7 a.m. in the morning, and you're probably still going come dinner time, depending on how much tuna you have to process. But when you're putting something in the freezer, it could be as simple as chopping it up getting it in an airtight container and sticking it in your freezer. So it can take a very small amount of time. It tastes the most like fresh, so the difference between a green bean that comes out of your freezer versus one that you've canned, the textures are going to be completely different. It's the most like the fresh product that you would get if you took it from the vine to your pot. And it's convenient for food preparation. So you can take things out of your freezer. Nowadays we have microwaves. We've got hot water to run things under. So it's a really easy way to make your dinner time a little quicker than not. So those are just some of the advantages to this method. There are also some disadvantages, and no, this is not a picture from my home, but it can cause some issues, right?
Those pull-out drawers are the worst.
Oh, I don't know if this is a top storage or what, but this person needs some help. And this isn't necessarily the biggest disadvantage. The biggest disadvantage of freezing, it could be the cost. And so if what you're stuck with at home is just the top or the bottom of your refrigerator unit, you're limited to space. You're limited on cost if you're looking at purchasing an upright or a chest freezer for your home. And then you have to have the space. So if you're living in a smaller unit, do you have the space? And so your cost, your space availability, both with the size of your freezer and the size of your home to house one of these freezers are disadvantages. You also want to think about the cost associated with plugging in your freezer and leaving it on at all times. Is that electricity cost going to be something that takes a toll on your finances? We'll talk about more specifically how to select a freezer, actually right now. Yeah. I guess the only other thing I would add is like, how much space do you think you need? And you'll think about that when you're selecting your freezer, but if you've got a large garden or you are trying to make a bunch of convenience meals for your family, a disadvantage of having a smaller freezer would be you're extremely limited in what you can store, and you have to be picky. You have to decide, like, out of this picture here, this family might start eating some of this stuff and clearing some way out, or perhaps not purchasing some of those store-bought freezer things to make way for other homemade deals. So I mentioned the 3 different types of freezers there are out there. The ones that are connected to your refrigerator, your chest freezer, and your stand-up, your uprights. They all have their own kind of things to consider. So when you're looking at your upright freezers, it takes up less floor space. So when you're thinking about where to store things, obviously your chest freezer is longer, and the uprights are more narrow, but the convenience of being able to open and look in, do you prefer that than having to open it up and dig in and have to come up with some sort of like method of sorting the madness? I've heard a lot of people with chest freezers get to the bottom and realize, oh, what is this thing? And it's not labeled. And you have to think about that when you're storing it too. So depending on which one you have, you're gonna just work with what you've got, you know. Your upright, the door, the stuff you store in your door will not maintain that same 0-degree temperature, which is what you want. Your refrigerator unit has a cycle of air that goes through too. So if you've ever had ice from your refrigerator freezer that tastes a little funky, that's because something in your refrigerator is circulating air into your freezer and creating a nasty taste. And that's a problem, and that actually can be prevented by some pre-treatment of foods. And also, I guess if you're using this refrigerator one, maintaining the stuff in your cold storage as well. Your chest freezer offers the most space for the money, they tell you, but organizing and retrieving, we said, could be difficult. Where you have your freezer matters. So not just having the room space for it, but where are you storing it? If you've got your freezer stored somewhere where the temperature fluctuates say like out in your shop, that could be a problem. The energy will run with your freezer much more frequently when it's hot out. It'll cause problems for you if the electricity does go out. But it also takes a toll on the unit, so they won't last as long. So you want to make sure your freezer is in a place that is, it's an unheated area. You want it to be not very fluctuating in temperature, and you want to make sure it's got space around it so that it has like some airflow, so that when it's sucking in air to keep its cool going, it's not got like a bunch of stuff from your garage all stored around it. When you're picking the size of your freezer, you want to think about your family needs. And I had a stat in here.
About the airflow,
Yeah.
does that mean it should be off of the wall?
Yeah, you don't want it flush up against the wall, just like
Okay.
you wouldn't want things really stored on this, like directly on the sides of it.
Okay, thank you.
The rule of thumb they have in here is 6 cubic feet of freezer space per person in your family. So you want to look at the cubic size of the freezer that you have, and I guess it really depends on, again, what types of foods you're really storing. One of the biggest differences in some of these solo freezers is the manual versus the self-defrost option. Your manual defrost freezers will actually save you some money because they don't have the energy that requires and the component that goes into the freezer that creates that self-defrosting mechanism actually makes your freezer cost more. But it's an inconvenience. So every 6 months, I guess that's the rule of thumb, although how many of us are going to defrost our freezers and clean it every 6 months? That's on you, right? So you'll save some money, it's more energy efficient, and it's more quiet. So depending on where you have this unit in your home as well, that might make a difference for you because it doesn't make quite as much noise. But the inconvenience of it is that you do have to take everything out. You have to unplug it. Sometimes you need to get a chisel in there if you're trying to get your food back in right away, right? And so that can be a deciding factor for you. Okay, so we'll talk about this more when we go into what to do if your freezer stops, but it's important to always keep your freezer full. So when you're thinking about how big of a freezer you want to have, you don't want to just have this massive upright freezer and then just have a couple convenience meals stored in there. It takes more energy to keep your stuff cold if there's not a lot of things in there. So things like milk jugs filled with water stuck in there to create more stuff in your freezer, I guess. But then those are also good because if you have things like emergency water needs, you take those out and you defrost them and then you've got emergency water as well. Some tips too for knowing whether or not your freezer has stopped, but also stocking your freezer is having a bucket of ice sitting in there or a bag of ice sitting in there, because you'll know whether or not you've had any fluctuations in temperature based on whether or not those ice cubes stay pliable, right? So if the temperature has gone up at all, they'll start to mold together. You can also freeze a cup of water in there, put a coin on top. If at any point you see that coin has dropped, you know that the top layer has defrosted a little bit and you've got some issues with your freezer temperature. So speaking of freezer temperatures, not all of them come with a thermometer in them. It is a good idea to keep a thermometer in your freezer just to make sure you can give it an eyeball every once in a while and it's sitting at that 0-degree temperature. You don't want to keep it in the door though, because like I said, that door will not hold as cold of a temperature as the back of your freezer. Just like your freezer needs air circulation, the products inside your freezer also need air circulation around them. The vents inside of them that keep the cold air going should never be blocked. And so I've actually had to reduce the amount of things I've had in some of my freezers because of this. You'll notice they're usually up at the top or down at the bottom. They're just vents, and you don't want to block them. And also be sure everything is labeled. So we'll talk about packaging, but just looking at some of these things and how deep they are and how much stuff you can fit in them might seem like, wow, I can freeze a lot of things. But again, you'll come across some mysterious packages if you don't use some good packaging practices. Freezing fruits and vegetables. So this is a quality thing. You will not have a food safety issue if you decide, I'm just going to chop up some broccoli and stick it in a bag and put it in the freezer. But you might, down the line, find that your broccoli kind of has like an off odor, the color of it may be changed, and that's because our fruits and vegetables all have enzymes in them, and those are to get them to their ripest point, but they also are for decomposition. And the freezer doesn't completely stop the process of what is decomposition, because that's what we're trying to change. We're trying to stop that process when we freeze them. It just slows it down. So things like your brassicas, your like cabbage and your broccoli and all of those hardier vegetables will start to break down, I mean, rather slowly, but after some time, if you're a year later going in your freezer for some of these things, they're not going to be quite as fresh. So you do want to always start with the fresh product. Like with any food preservation, it's quality in, quality out. When you're preparing your fruits and vegetables, it's nice to get them into the serving size that you think you're going to use them in. So, if you're doing green beans, you want to make sure you're snapping the ends off and getting them into the size that you're going to want them for your meal. And that can be full. Most vegetables, save for your peppers and your onions, will need to be blanched before you freeze them. And again, that's to save the texture and quality of the product. And does everyone know how to blanch things? Yeah. Yes? If not, in your packet, there is a handout in there specific to freezing fruits and vegetables. It'll actually tell you because blanching times will be different for different vegetables. And so it'll go through a whole chart in there on how long to blanch things for. So after you've blanched your vegetables, say you've done green beans, you've cut them all up and you've blanched them, you want to strain them. And then what I like to do is actually lay a towel out on my table and spread them out to dry. You never want to take a wet vegetable and package it and stick it in the freezer. You're just going to get a clump that comes out. It's not the worst thing if you know you're going to cook them all. But for me, I'm going to do a big bag of green beans, just like you would buy at the grocery store. But I grew these green beans, and so I want to make sure they're coming out right. So after you've sort of dried them off, you can freeze them on a tray like you would your berries. So it's usually the most common thing that's frozen out here, fruit-wise, are berries because they are so abundant, and they're very easy to stick in your freezer. But you just sheet pan them, stick them in the freezer until they've frozen, and then you can package them and put them in bags. Try not to forget about them in there. I'm definitely guilty of forgetting them in there. But if you do, they'll get crystallization on them. They'll oxidize. You can still eat them. They are safe, but they won't taste very good. So try to remember. Some things that will happen if you don't end up blanching, you'll get a tough, stringy texture in your vegetables, specifically for things like spinach, broccoli, and asparagus. You can get some softening of the product as well. It won't have quite the bite to it. I talked about the odor that it can take on, color changes, and things like your potatoes will get a gray discoloration on them, which again, you can eat it. It is safe, but it might not taste quite like you thought it would. To pre-treat your fruit, there is an abundance of options actually. There are pre-treat products out there that, Ball makes their fruit fresh that is easily purchased at lots of grocery stores in town, hardware stores, that sort of thing. But you can also do an ascorbic acid or a vitamin C dip, which is where you literally just create a water solution that has a specific amount of either vitamin C tablets crushed up or ascorbic acid, and they soak for a set amount of time, which is also all in your handout. And then again, you just lay them out and you sheet pan freeze them and package them later on. Is there a question?
No, you can just crush vitamin C.
Yeah.
That's that easy.
Yep. Your fruits can also be packed in syrup. You can sprinkle them with sugar. You can just dry pack them. Some of them can just be dry packed, which means you just sheet pan in the freezer. Those are things like your raspberries, blueberries, blackberries, that sort of thing. You can pack them in juice, water, or they can be packed in pectin, which when they then defrost have a more gelatin-like texture to them. So if you're thinking of like what's a consistency that, like if you're making a strawberry shortcake and you're defrosting just your strawberries for it, if you had just defrosted strawberries that either were sprinkled in sugar or by themselves, they would just kind of be very liquidy. If you pack them in a pectin pack, which also includes sugar, it would have that nice, beautiful sheen of red, thick gravy with it. And so it would make a really nice dessert. And for that, it's 1 package of dry pectin, 3 cups of sugar, and 3 gallons of berries. So do the math as you will if you don't have 3 gallons, right? You want to make sure you're freezing things as quick as possible as well. And so with that, it's having that space available, but also not letting it sit out. After you've done your pre-treatment, you want to make sure you know that you're going to be finishing the process that day. You're not just going to stick it in the refrigerator or what have you. You want to start to finish, put it in the freezer, be good to go. And then just a tip that the higher the moisture content in your food, the mushier your defrosted product is going to be. So when we say that frozen, the freezing food preservation method comes the most consistent with the real thing, it's not true for everything. We all know that when we defrost our berries, a lot of them end up just weeping. That is a really great way to juice your fruit, which is a side note to the topic. But I prefer to make my jams and jellies in the wintertime because it's not so hot and I'm not boiling water in my kitchen. And it's the easiest way to juice them for me because I don't have a juicer at home, to freeze them and then thaw them out, and I just put them over a colander in my sink in a bowl, and I've got the juice really easily to be able to do jelly without all of those wonderful seeds that are in our berries. So while I'm on this topic, so I don't forget that I brought this, and I can actually have this happen because I did a class on freezer meals last year, and I was telling this table here earlier that I had bought my Instant Pot like a month before that class, and I was super excited to test it out. And I even brought like a frozen chicken. I'm doing a thawed one today. But this is a great way to be able to use some of your frozen meats and not have to worry about the fact that when you have frozen meat, you are not supposed to cook them in your crock pot. And I'll talk to you about that when we go over convenience meals. But my point being is that class, I put the chicken in, and at the end of class, I was like, voila, and it was not cooked, you guys.
Oh.
It was like, whoa.
Ooh, that was, yeah.
And the thing is that when you cook a chicken in your crock pot, you know you don't need liquid with it. If you do like just chicken cut up, you don't need to put liquid with it. You can just season it. But your Instant Pot is a well, it's both a crock pot, it's all these other things, but it's a pressure cooker, and in order to come up to pressure, it needs liquid. And why I didn't maybe read the directions or what have you. But this is one of mine, so we're stopping at meat to talk about this and use it, but then when we get to convenience meals, I'll go over it again. Probably won't be done. But basically you can take a frozen chicken, stick it in here with, what I'm gonna use is some chicken broth, and I cut up the makings of a chicken soup, so carrots, onion, celery, garlic. And for convenience afterwards, I'll talk to you about what I like to do with this on like a monthly basis. But literally, I'm just dumping it in. Try to stay food safe over here. Like I said, this could be frozen. And it would still not take very long. But your chicken in your Instant Pot of whole chicken, while it doesn't take into account the coming up to pressure and coming down from pressure, you really only need 25 minutes. And it sings to you, so it's kind of nice. And it's already set because I probably had last done a chicken in there, and that's all I have to do. And make sure it's unsealed. Okay, so we'll talk about that again. It's doing its thing.
It's on.
When we get a little further on. So let's talk about when we have meat that we want to store in our freezer. Just meat. How many of you buy meat at your grocery store and go ahead and put that package right in your freezer? I do it too, but we shouldn't. So it's not as airtight as you think it is. It's suggested that you either take that package and stick it in the extra Ziploc bag so that it's a lot more airtight, or take the meat out and actually use some, freezer paper with it, and then take your freezer paper, label it what it is, and stick it in a bag or something like that. The reason being that you want to make sure that the surface area of your meat is completely covered and that it's airtight. Those packages have like the cellophane or the whatever they are on the bottom, and just some saran wrap around them. They're really not doing much for the meat other than displaying it for you. And so if you want to have that not just for next week, you want it for like 3 months from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, you definitely want to repackage it. And I will say that one of the reasons that I personally love Meat Bonanza, aside from the fact that it is a really great time to shop because things are inexpensive, is that you can take those big packages of meat that they're selling, cut it into the portion sizes that your family needs, and repackage it in a way that you can freeze and not, like what else are you going to do with such a mass amount of meat? So, I mean, again, not to plug any stores, but take advantage of your Meat Bonanzas when they're out there and get some practice with how to package some of your meats. Yes, always label things, including the date. So especially when you're repackaging up meat, you want to know when you bought it. And so some of those packages might even say like when it's good till, but just put on there at least when you bought it, when you stuck it in the freezer, and what it is, especially if you're using the butcher paper. Otherwise, it's just a mystery package. Always keep your meat and your vegetables separate. And this is what I wanted to talk about when we get to convenience meals, is that a lot of those things out there on the internet will show you these bags full of dump meals for your crock pot, and they're just throwing everything into this bag. They're not pre-treating their vegetables, but they're also putting their meat with the vegetables in there. That's a really great way to spread bacteria. You're supposed to defrost your meals before you stick them in your crock pot, and so it can cause some really food safe issues if you do that. Your fish, so this top right is a water pack for your fish. And then you can also use like a vacuum sealer, which I didn't bring an example of, but those are the best ways to package your fish. You can also do, I forget what they call it, but you put them on the sheet pan, you spray them with water, you let it freeze, it's a glaze. You spray them again until they have like a little crust on them of ice that you've created, and then you can put them in your Ziploc bags and they won't stick together. So if you're not able to individually package them with like a food seal deal, and you don't want to water pack because it's just going to create you a iceberg of fish, you can go ahead and try the glaze method, which again is spraying, freezing until they've got a little bit of a crust on them. If you're doing game meat, you want to make sure it's rested for at least 24 hours before you're putting it in the freezer. It needs to go through that process of rigor mortis, otherwise the texture of your meat, the taste and all that is going to be off. We talked about repackaging the stuff that you get at the grocery store, and then you want to make sure when you're thawing out your meat that you're doing it in a safe way. If you've used your food sealer, you always want to pierce a hole in your package before you defrost it. So if you end up taking this fish out of the freezer and you're doing the big no-no, you're leaving it on your counter all day to defrost, you're creating this environment that is the perfect breeding ground for things like botulism. It's defunct of oxygen, so it's an anaerobic condition. You're getting it to that temperature, that's room temperature, so it's in that food safety danger zone, which is 40 degrees to 140 degrees. For longer than 2 hours, the bacteria just starts to breed. And it's not just the breeding of the bacteria, because it does happen very quickly, but then they start to release their toxins, and that's the stuff that you can't remove, even if you're getting it to 165 degrees, which is where those bacteria are killed, but their toxins won't be. And so to safely defrost your meat, you do want to do it in the refrigerator. This picture here of the turkey in the refrigerator that has a nice little drip pan underneath it. It's on, we're assuming, a bottom shelf, because that's where it should be. You don't want it to be anywhere that it can potentially leak down onto other things, especially if, like most refrigerators nowadays, or mine at least, my vegetable trays, my little crispers are on the bottom. Have they changed that in more modern products? Because they should. You're supposed to defrost things on your bottom shelf, and if you've got vegetables underneath them, you know, it's a recipe for disaster if you've got something that leaks underneath it. So defrosting in your refrigerator is the recommended process, but if you're in a pinch for time, you can use the defrost mechanism on your microwave. I've not successfully figured out how to defrost things in mine without sort of cooking the edges. So check your manufacturer's instructions to do that, or, you know, practice. You can also run things under warm water. So taking a thing of chicken out of your freezer to make dinner, you can get a thing of water in your sink and let it sit for a bit. But again, it's that 2-hour time frame. You don't want to do it any longer than that. And then know that there's a potential for bacteria to spread in things like your sink, your countertops, and stuff like that when you're defrosting in other areas. Your refrigerator as well, you'll want to make sure you clean it, but we're always worried about the spread of bacteria when we're defrosting meat. And then the reason I'm doing this here is because you can freeze your cooked meats. I mean, that's not like a shocking revelation, right? Because we were talking all about our raw meats here. But one of the most convenient things that I have found is to pre-cook meat and freeze it to make my evenings go a little quicker. And I think we're going into convenience meals, so I'll just start talking about all the stuff that I'm super excited to talk about. So I guess we'll start with, because I started talking about freezing your meats, is that things like pre-made meatballs. In the back there we made, I made, the Sloppy Joe mix. That can be portion sized into what your family needs for a meal, and much quicker than defrosting some ground beef and getting all the ingredients and this and that for your evening, all you're having to do is either stick it on the stovetop in a pot or microwave it, and you have sloppy joes in a minute. Well, you know, several minutes, but a lot quicker than having to defrost meat and cook it and go through that whole process. Does it take some time up front to do all of these things? Yeah, sure. I'm not quite certain how many meals this produced in the back here, but for what was, I don't know, like 6 hours of my time today, those meals back there would feed my family for quite some time, and I was able to do it with a 2-year-old by my side, so, you know, it's doable. It's not necessarily super fun, but future you is really thankful for past you for putting that time in. And it's a really easy thing to do, say on like a Sunday, you can have football in the background. But one of the things that I really like to do is cook meat ahead of time. This chicken, when it comes out, what I will have is shredded chicken meat. I'll usually separate the dark from the light because my husband likes the light and I like the dark. But I think they lend themselves to different meals. So you can shred it, you can chop it, put it in what you think you're going to use it for. So shredded meat for me is better for tacos, whereas like the chunked up stuff is better for things like a stir fry later. But the fact that I put the broth in there with all of those vegetables then for soup is that I've then got the makings of a quick chicken broth as well. I like to freeze things in my ball canning jars, specifically the wide mouths, because they have these really convenient plastic tops you can put on them, and they'll even tell you where to fill them to freeze at so that they don't break in your freezer. And even if you're not pulling the veggies out and you've just got broth, or you didn't do the vegetables and you just take the broth out, having chicken broth in your freezer is a really great time saver as well for quick soups or making gravies or reductions or that sort of thing. But kind of whole chicken for me is at least a week's worth of meals. But again, it depends on the size of your family. The easiest way to start stocking your convenience meals is to have things on hand at home. So I have a whole cupboard dedicated to these tin foil deals. They come in all different shapes and sizes. Also like little gift sizes for people if you're crafty like that. And they sell them at the Dollar Tree. So you can get packets like this for $1. And if you make a large casserole, or you've decided you're making a lasagna for your family, make enough for 2 and freeze half of it. So you plan ahead and you've got your meal for the night, but then you're putting some in the freezer and you've got a meal for, 6 months down the road. That is the quickest way to stock your freezer without the extra work of like spending 6 hours in the kitchen specifically for freezer meals. Obviously they save time and money, but the considerations you need to make when you're testing out these convenience foods in your freezer is trying them ahead of time. And that's really why I wanted to make sure to have some tasting samples and to send you home with recipes, because if you like it, then you'll freeze it and you can make an abundance of it. One of the things that you received in your packet is actually from Utah State University. They're another land-grant university that has an extension service. And they've put together this really cool handout that includes a 1-week freezer meal plan that includes a grocery list, all of the recipes to go along with it, and instructions on how to properly package it and label it and all that. The Sloppy Joe mix comes from here. What I thought was super cool is that the first recipe on there is for a base meat sauce. And that meat sauce then lends itself to this pasta, sloppy joes, spaghetti mix, and chili. And so you can plan ahead, make just that meat mix, and pull it out and add all the ingredients you need to make all of these other things with it. I would probably add a lot more vegetables to some of the recipes, but that's what's fun about a recipe and your freezer and food preservation in this method, is that you can add stuff to it. If you were canning something, we'd say never deviate from the recipe. But absolutely, when you're just cooking for food storage in your freezer or your family at night, if you like extra vegetables or your flavor preferences are different than what they have, you can alter some of it. But this is a nice test menu that includes shopping, meal planning, and all of that. I thought it was fabulous.
To check their pages and make sure that they're printed on both sides.
Yeah, no, mine aren't, and
So
I
if
have
you've given me your
two of these,
email,
but-
I'll make sure to send you the handouts. We have an issue with our printer in our office right now. It's rebelling against us all. So, yes, thank you for letting me know. One thing I did notice is that the other recipes in there are missing the back side as well. And
Yes.
so the quinoa, black bean, and
Yes.
sweet potato recipe is not in there. And I'll make sure you guys get that. If you don't have an email address or don't want to leave one, we can also just have those handouts available in our office to pick up. I'm also willing to mail stuff, so if you'd like something mailed to you, just let me know. The other two recipes in this packet, though, the ones that did appear, one of them does include that sweet Asian chicken recipe.
Mhm.
And then the other that you didn't get to sample, but that I have personally sampled and made, is a feta and spinach lasagna roll. It's very easy. It kind of takes your lasagna to a different level because it has feta in it. I personally enjoy it. Let's see. So we talked about the fact that you can use varieties with your recipes, and just to really send it home, you never want to do those crock pot recipes that show you putting your meat, your veggies, and everything all in one. And it really is a food safety issue. So when we're talking about all of these quality things and none of it being food safety, this is the one area that it really is, because when you are defrosting that in your refrigerator overnight, which you should be, it will sit in that not great food zone for too long. If you're putting it frozen in your crock pot, again, it doesn't get it to temperature fast enough because it is a slow, low cooker. It's a lower temperature, it takes a longer period of time, and to get it to the 165 degrees it needs to be safe to consume, you don't really get there.
So would you suggest putting a separate bag in the
Yes,
bag?
absolutely. So if you wanted to do those recipes, if you thought, that still sounds pretty good, first of all, I would try it in your crock pot ahead of time before freezing it all, right? So take your raw meat, raw vegetables like you would to just cook a meal in your crock pot and test it out. You could even then just freeze it that way after it's cooked. But it might get to a point where the texture isn't as great as you'd like. So if you do want some of those dump meals, yes, you can package them such that you're keeping your meat separate. I would also suggest going through the process of blanching those vegetables, only because the texture will be so much different. And if you're spending all of that time and money to have something that you think you're going to want to consume later on, you might as well take the time to do it right. Talked about the reason behind that, and that's really because even though the bacteria has formed and you can kill that, you cannot kill the toxins that come from it. And we just can't guarantee whether or not that's happened or not. Any convenience meal that you've done, so like if I've made extra lasagna at home and I want to have it for dinner the next night, you definitely want to take it out of your freezer and let it thaw overnight. Depending on how cold your refrigerator is, it might take up to 2 days. And just keep that in mind, that that convenience factor might not be there if you don't have that forethought to say, I need to take it out because I want to eat this tomorrow. You'll end up having your lasagna at like midnight because it will just take that long to get it there. Unless you package it in something other than foil. So we will talk more about packaging, but you can use your Tupperwares. You can use glass, plastic, anything that's hard and airtight. So these aren't like the best examples, but I forgot mine and I asked the library, does anyone have lunch containers that I can use? So These are usable. You can even use things like the things you get at your grocery store that have yogurt in them to freeze your foods, but know that they're not airtight, and you should probably take an extra step of, say, I don't have saran wrap here, but take your saran wrap and put a seal down on whatever the product is in there, and then put your lid on, because that'll at least keep the surface from getting crystallized by stuff. But if you're doing that, if you've got it in glass, if you've got it in something that isn't going to explode in your microwave or create a fire, you can quickly eat your lasagna that same day without having to defrost it in your freezer or in your refrigerator. They say it's best to eat the foods that you're storing convenience-wise within 3 to 6 months. That is a quality thing. So if a year from now you still have that casserole from Christmas saved in there, you can eat it. I don't know if it'll taste quite as good, but it's safe. Using freezer design containers, we talked about that. And so, couple things, just a list of foods that freeze really well and that I've personally tried at home and I think really do add convenience. I did the muffins back there because those are great. Not only for a snack, but for breakfast or dessert. You can do muffins and cookies as well. Those sorts of things take minutes or seconds even in the microwave to warm up. A full-size muffin at like 15 seconds is like steaming hot. So you really don't need much time to defrost those, and they taste basically just like they would if they've not necessarily just come out of the oven, because they won't have that crispy outer layer. They will be a little moist, but like after a week on your counter, that's about where that's about where it's at. It's still good. Waffles and pancakes are really great and convenient. I think a lot of times when we're talking about freezing convenience meals, we're all thinking dinner, at least I typically am. But it's easy to forget that our breakfast time can be a rush as well, and it's great to have some of those things that are easy to quickly heat up. I have also done breakfast burritos in the freezer. They are good, but not great. And so that's something I warn people with caution, because the eggs do get a little chewier. Your tortilla wrap can get moist. And so if you microwave it and then you have some time and you get a skillet out, you can give it a crust on it that way. Otherwise, you just have to be okay with a little bit of a soggy burrito. It still tastes pretty decent. You can also use English muffins to do just like a breakfast sandwich with the egg texture. Just know it might be a little different than you're used to. Things like biscuits and pies, both baked and unbaked, do really well in the freezer, except for your cream pies. It seems like the stability of the fats in some of those creamy, cheesier type things don't really uphold the process of defrosting it is. It's not that you can't freeze it, because you totally can, but once it defrosts, it's gonna have like just a lot of liquid going on. Soups are great in the freezer. Different purees, so you can do different types of baby foods, or if you like to make smoothies, this is a great place to have some ice cube sized smoothie chips to just kind of go ahead and put them back in the blender. Skillet meals, but again, you can either pre-cook the meat or freeze it separately. That makes it food safe. Pasta dishes do great. I keep mentioning lasagna because that's something I like to personally cook, and I don't know how to cook it for less than like an army, so it's always easy for me to stash some away. Twice baked potatoes make a really easy and great side dish that are super easy to freeze and come back to life really well. Individual or full-sized pizzas in your freezer, homemade, do really well. I usually try to keep these stocked for my family because it's a great thing to do on a Friday. Just throw your pizza in. You can also just do the dough. So if you are someone who likes to make your own pizza dough, you can freeze it. It does really well. Even you do want to set it in your refrigerator for a day and then let it rise again, but that stuff does really well in there too. And then I think there's like a whole other list in this handout here, freezing convenience foods, that has some more tips about how things really do come out. There's a lot of info about potatoes not doing all that great, and again, that's because they defrost kind of funny, although the twice bakes do really well. So this handout has what the food is, how to prepare it, how to thaw and heat it, and then the suggested amount of time that it's best for quality in your freezer. Really great handout.
I saw that it said do not freeze block cheese. Can you freeze shredded cheese?
I have frozen shredded cheese. Again, that's not a safety issue. It's just not gonna constitute very well when it defrosts. So like a block cheese will get really sweaty,
Right.
and I mean, it depends what you're gonna do with it too. If you're gonna freeze it and you know you're gonna make like a macaroni with it,
Okay.
test it out, but don't buy like the $20 block of fancy cheese. And
No, I was wondering about shredded cheese.
yeah, shredded cheese does fine.
It does fine?
Mhm.
Okay.
A lot of the shredded cheeses are you personally shredding it, or are you buying it pre-shredded?
It's already pre-shredded.
The pre-shredded cheese that you buy at the grocery store is coated with like a modified cornstarch or like a potato coating to it, and so it
Holds up well.
holds up really well. They stay separated, and even when they do defrost, although you're not going to want to defrost it with it sealed because it will stay real wet and gross in there,
Yeah.
but that'll absorb some of the moisture too. So, yes. Anyone have questions about freezing convenience foods? Okay,
There's a lot of it right here.
there's a lot.
Good
Yeah.
information right there.
So I just wanted to touch on packaging, and I know we've kind of talked a little bit about it as we went through, but really just making sure it's something that's sturdy, that's going to hold up, and that you're able to label. I don't want to say that enough. Label your stuff when you stick it in your freezer, because even your, your meat, your soups, and all of that, you're going to forget what it is, even though you don't think you will. Like, oh, did I mix in my meatballs that I just did, do those have the sausage in them, or do they not have the sausage in them? Like, I didn't put that on mine, and I should have. So it's really nice to get a good label going. You want them to be strong, durable, and leak-proof. Containers that are vapor resistant. So that's where when we talk about sticking your packages straight from the grocery store into the freezer, they're not vapor resistant. They tend to hold moisture and all that too. Has anyone ever frozen anything with foil directly on it? Tends to stick right to it. And so I always recommend either using your freezer paper and then some foil, or like a saran wrap and then foil over it. If you are giving a freezer meal, if you're giving a freezer meal as a gift and you've got saran wrap and then you've got foil, make sure on your label and your instructions on how to cook it, because that's the nice thing to do when you give a freezer meal to someone, is the instructions of like, hey, take it out or defrost it in the refrigerator for 24 hours and don't forget to remove the saran wrap, because otherwise they've got a whole layer of food they can't eat, and that's just me. I would eat it after the top layer, but they should probably toss the whole thing.
Is freezer paper parchment paper, is that the same thing, or is it?
You know, they're not. And this is mine from home, that's why it looks all rugged. They are not the same thing, although in a pinch, I have used wax paper instead. And I don't know the particulars on what makes them different, but this one says it's plastic coated, so if you're anti-plastic, maybe that's not for you. But they also make butcher paper. You just can't find it in town. A lot of these things are just what I was limited to being able to get in town. But butcher paper is great because you can buy big blocks of it. Your kids can use it to draw on.
So if you bought some meat from the butcher and he's wrapped it in butcher paper, you should just wrap it in foil and it should be fine to go in the freezer?
If I bought something that was wrapped in butcher paper, I would probably stick it then in this, unless I got it from like I had my meat processed somewhere.
Yes.
They will typically have, if you've done that, you'll notice they have like a plastic sheath around the meat, and then they do their butcher paper. So
Yeah.
those are fine.
Those are fine.
Those butchers know what they're doing.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, if someone's just packaged it up for you to make a package look pretty, because
Oh, yeah, your butcher, like,
with
on
some-
the little meat things above you.
just
No.
inspect it and see what you think.
Well, they think that you're gonna cook it that night, probably.
That's true. That's true. We talked about the vacuum sealer. And what happens if we don't package our stuff correctly? We get spoilage, and there it is. There's your grocery store stuck in the freezer sausages that now have freezer burn on them. And again, it's not a food safety issue. The quality of this is just not going to be great. Your meats dry out. Your vegetables also dry out. They get that like discoloration where it's a little lighter in color, and the texture is really not great. What's happening is you've got enzymes that have broken down and have been oxidized, so oxygen has hit them and they've started to decompose. Your meat is also subject to rancidity, so anything with fat in it is potentially going to go rancid if it's not packaged correctly, and that will taste really nasty. It won't kill you, but I wouldn't serve it to my friends and family. Anything that isn't cooled before you stick it in the freezer will also get ice crystals on it from the condensation that happens. And so if I was gonna freeze these meals that I made in the back there, I would let them cool a little bit before I stuck them into the freezer. The fastest way to cool things like your soups and your big pots of chili is to put them in a shallow pan and stick that in the freezer for a little bit and let it cool off before you package it. And the reason for that, again, is that food safety zone is not, you're gonna sit in that food danger zone too long if you just take your big pot of chili and stick that in the freezer. They tell you even if you're going to put your big pots of soup and chili in the refrigerator, you need to cool them in your shallow pans as well. Will be the first to tell you I don't always do this at home, but if I was serving a crowd, if I was serving or bringing something to a potluck that I had made the day before, you want to make sure you follow those practices because there are segments of the population that are more subject to foodborne illnesses than others. The elderly, people with compromised immune systems, pregnant ladies amongst us, young children, their immune systems aren't necessarily as strong as like your fellow neighbor. And so you want to make sure you're following the right practices to not get anyone ill off of the food you serve. And then lastly, because I said at the beginning, the biggest inconvenience of using your freezer to preserve foods is the fact that your freezer can fail you or your electricity can fail you. So whether that's the actual unit itself or your power supply fails, it is a big risk that you take packing stuff into your freezer. So the number one thing to do is make sure you keep your door closed. Don't go looking in there to make dinner for the evening if you don't have power or your freezer has broken. Find another route to cook. You can insulate it by covering it in blankets. So that creates another layer of barrier between any fluctuation in temperature, but also just insulating around it. There are instructions on how to use dry ice to keep your stuff cold, and this is if it's going to be a significant amount of time where your power is going to be out. And that's in the handout that I talked to you about, and I'm pretty sure you can actually buy dry ice in town, so that is an option for us here. Keeping your freezer full at all times will also help things stay frozen longer should your power fail, because they have all of that insulated cooling around it. And so, again, keeping things like gallons of water in there, or even just the things that you use in your cooler in the summer to take out beverages if you're going to the river, pack them all in there if you've got the space, because the more space you've taken up, the better your chances are if your freezer fails. A full freezer will actually last about 2 to 4 days. That's pretty good. If it's half full, you've got about 24 hours. And then how do you know whether or not the stuff in there is safe to eat after those 2 to 4 days, right? So thinking about what to toss or keep, any of your convenience foods that you've made and you've spent 6 hours in the kitchen cooking, those should all go. Anything that's a vegetable that's thawed completely, your fish that's thawed completely, and clearly your ice cream. I don't know why they even bother putting that on there, but if your ice cream's melted, you should probably throw it away. It's okay to refreeze things like your fruits and your breads that you've got in there, so long as it's not been so long that they've molded. And so they will end up being obviously really kind of soggy, but you can refreeze those. Your pastries are also okay. So, and again, as long as there's no mold on them. When you're refreezing, make sure you do it quickly. Assuming the power's come back on and you've got the ability to do so, put the temperature of your freezer at the lowest setting it can go. Some of them will go to below 0. And so set it there, get your stuff frozen quickly. And that's also a good tip too, if you do know, I was telling some guys here beforehand that I knew that Coos Curry was coming to do some power line work at my house, and it was going to be like a 5 or 6 hour ordeal. The tip in here says, set your freezer down below 0 for at least 1 to 2 days prior to that scheduled outage, and that'll help to extend the freezing power of your food, for lack of better words. And I didn't do that, but I was okay. It was only a couple hours. It's a good tip. And with that, that is really all I have on our quality and safety issues with 10 minutes. Watch this. It's called a quick release. You never do that if you're actually canning food. But when you're cooking it, it's not a part of the processing time. The chicken facial. Where would you find dry ice? I have heated at McKay's.
Really?
Uh-huh.
I don't know what kind of food that is.
Yeah. And people use it to do things like you can use dry ice to do like that crazy smoke for Halloween. I've not done it. So like I said, this is how you take it quick. It's called quick releasing your Instant Pot from being pressurized. Some recipes actually call for you to do this. You're supposed to do it with a mitt on your hand, but I'm okay. And again, if you were pressure canning any low acid foods at home, that's a big no-no, because your depressurization of your canner is actually part of the entire counted process of making sure that that product is food safe. This is just me risking it not being fully cooked again. And then I'll go for third time's the charm if it is. And all it does is make it so that I can eventually open it. But you guys, your Instant Pot, you can actually do some of those. Like I said, you're not supposed to cook your frozen meats in your crock pot. You can do that in your Instant Pot because it does get to temperature much faster than your slow cooker does. We have to recommend that you make sure to look at your manufacturer's safety instructions. All of these come with their own booklets and cookbooks and all of that. And I've done like full pork shoulders frozen to cooked in just a matter of like a couple of hours. It's really nice.
You said that there's something you have to do twice a month with your Instant Pot? With clean, with food?
I said with your freezer, if you've got your,
Oh,
the manual defrost has to be every 6 months, you're supposed to be doing that. There are instructions on how to deep clean your Instant Pot. I've not had a problem just soaping hot water, scrubbing it down. Your liner inside of it actually fits really well into your dishwasher. I've not put the lid in there, although I don't think there's a problem with doing that. I just haven't because I haven't read the booklet. I'm honest.
I haven't done mine either, it just looks like it needs to be scrubbed manually.
Yeah, and the one thing I always forget about is this little trap back here. I'm glad it's in the back, you guys, because it doesn't look very pretty right now.
so what's the difference between Instant Pot and a pressure cooker?
Nothing, besides the fact that, so it is a pressure cooker. When you use the pressure cooker feature to it,
It browns, that's the best thing before you pressure cook.
it's the fact that you can just set it and know that it's doing its thing, rather than,
And it's crock pot, it does always done.
And
And it cooks rice.
Did you say it browns for me?
Yeah,
Yes.
with a browning option.
so, I'm not endorsing a product, but I will tell you that this thing has changed my weekday cooking world, especially when it comes to things that I typically would have done in a crock pot. There are certain foods that when you're doing it in your crock pot, the recipe will say brown your meat first. Well, you can't do that in your crock pot, but you can in your Instant Pot. It has a saute feature on it. So you just set that on to low, medium, or high, put some oil in there, brown your meat, and then switch it to crock pot or switch it to pressure cook and throw all the rest of your ingredients in, and you're good to go. It's really great for doing, and plug for my class next week, because we are doing soups, stews, and chilies on next Thursday at 5:30, and there again will be some food. The fact that when you do your soups or anything like that in your crock pot, you don't have the ability, unless you're also dirtying a pot on your stovetop, and then it, in my mind, defeats the purpose. But you can't get that, like, your mirepoix, your carrots, onions, and celery sauteing in butter or whatever fat you like. You're just usually throwing it in there raw, and it comes out fine. But like the depth of flavor that you get when you actually brown your meat or saute things ahead of time is a lot more complex than just throwing things in with some water and broth or whatever.
It's the caramelization that's really...
I thoroughly enjoy it. You can also reheat things in your Instant Pot, but you cannot reheat things in your crock pot because it doesn't get to temperature fast enough, and so you're keeping your food in that danger zone again. I did not cook those meals in the crock pots back there. I cooked them at home on the stovetop, and then I used these as my method to keep things warm. So they are just set on warm. They were fully cooked to temperature at home and then put in there. If I had cooled them in my refrigerator, you cannot reheat them, you should not reheat them in your crock pot, but you can use your saute feature and bring them up to temperature on here, because it's no different than having just a skillet on your stovetop, which is really cool. I've not done the rice or yogurt or any of that in here just because, I don't
I've
know.
done mine.
Yeah.
From that
People say
point.
it's really nice for that. It also does, like, apparently you can do your eggs in there really quickly too. This is like the longest, still not doing it. Just gonna keep talking.
Well, it's still cooking, if it's on, and once it's off, then it'll stop, the pressure will stop.
Can you lift the inner part out and put it in the refrigerator?
You can, but if it's got anything larger than like 2 to 3 inches,
Yeah,
you need to put it in your sheet pans and cool it quicker
okay.
before you can store it. But yeah, the liner comes out nice and easy, and it's not a crock, so it's not super heavy. It's like a lighter tin of some sort, metal, if you will.
Aluminum, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I think these are really great for reheating your convenience meals. I think they're just really convenient to have. But if you have a pressure cooker at home that you're comfortable with and you have used, absolutely you can still use those in the same manner. Yeah.
I threw out my pressure cooker, my rice cooker, and my crock pot, and I have it.
I haven't taken the leap to throw them out yet. They sit on upper shelves in places. But then they come in handy for things like this when I'm doing a class and I need extra crock pots.
But my pressure cooker exploded on me, and it was a new one. I had, and this is much safer. This
That's
locks
scary.
down really well.
It sings to you.
Yeah. No, it did. It changed my life too.
But I will tell you that, on a weeknight, if I had this chicken at home and I did this way, I would be making a meal out of some of the chicken that I pulled off, whether it was just something simple and a side vegetable and starch with some chicken, or, shredded some up and made tacos, and then the rest of it would be stored in the freezer, in the broth as well. And it just is super easy, convenient. You've made a meal out of it, and you've stacked some in your freezer, and you've saved yourself hours of time and money as well, because what's the alternative? Going to the grocery store and buying like a rotisserie chicken that's already done for you. They're equally as delicious though, but
Yeah.
it's moving. Okay, she says she's done.
See, it got right in those.
Oh yeah, she's done. So, and it legit smells like some chicken soup in here. If anyone would like to take a peek, they can. It's the only difference in doing your meat in here, even if you're browning it, is that you're not gonna get, it's not a roasted chicken. You don't wanna eat this skin. My dogs like to eat this skin, but it's a moist skin. It's like boiling a chicken. But the meat tends to be very moist, very easy to shred. In fact, I'm not even going to attempt to pull it out of there because I can tell, if you want to take a look, that it will just fall straight apart. So, again, that really cool feature in there too is the fact that it's got a little wire rack. And because I just dumped the chicken in and I was talking at the same time, I didn't put the handles on the side, but you can just lift that out of there, put it in your sheet pan to cool off, and you're good to go. So it worked this time. I'm pretty pumped about that. And I'll be able to use this next week because I will cool it appropriately, and just be able to use it for the soup, stews, and chilies that we're gonna be doing. So double duty, but highly recommend these for convenience. Not just for convenient freezer meals, but convenience in general. Does anyone have any other questions? Are we ready to go home and stock our freezers?
Just how to get those recipes that I'm
So
missing.
if you've left me with your
I
email
did.
address up there, I will do that tomorrow. If not, at the latest Monday. I'll get those recipes out. We're missing 2. Looks like the back side of the one.
Chili and the cheesy pasta.
Yep, and I
And the
will,
pasta meat sauce too. All 3 of them are not on here.
they're in mine. I'm gonna give you mine. If I've got it up here.
This one's only got the chicken enchilada and the orange.
Yep, you can take mine for now, but I will email it out because it does seem like
Oh, yes.
our copy machine
Didn't get
did
the
the
second
ultimate
page,
fail and,
yes.
and missed some of the back sides of some of these. Thank you all for coming.